How do you know?" "No, Mamma, don't speak to him. What nonsense!" said Natasha, in the tone of a man being robbed of his property. "Well, I won't marry him, so let him come if he enjoys it, and I enjoy it." Natasha looked at her mother, smiling. "Not to be married, but just so," she repeated. "How so, my dear?" "Oh, just so. I see it's very necessary I shouldn't marry him, but just so." "Just so, just so," repeated the Countess, and, shaking all over, she went off into a good-natured, unexpectedly elderly laugh. "Don't laugh, stop!" cried Natasha. "You're shaking all the bed. You're awfully like me, just another giggler. Stop!" She snatched both the Countess's hands, kissed one knuckle of the little finger for June, and went on kissing, July, August, on the other hand. "Mamma, is he very much in love? What do you think? Were men as much in love with you? And he's very nice, very, very nice. Only not quite to my liking. He's so narrow, somehow, like a clock on the wall. Don't you understand? Narrow, you know, grey, light-coloured." "What nonsense you talk," said the Countess. Natasha went on. "Don't you really understand? Nikolenka would understand. Betsuhoff now, he's blue, dark blue and red, and he's quadrangular." "You're flirting with him, too," said the Countess, laughing. "No, he's a Freemason, I have heard. He's jolly, dark blue and red. How am I to explain to you?" "Little Countess," they heard the Count's voice through the door, "you're not asleep?" Natasha skipped up, snatched up her slippers, and ran barefoot to her own room. For a long while she could not go to sleep. She kept musing on no one's being able to understand all she understood, and all that was in her. "Sonia?" she wondered, looking at her friend asleep, curled up like a kitten, with her great mass of hair. No, how could she? She's virtuous. She's in love with Nikolenka, and doesn't care to know anything more. Mamma, even she doesn't understand. It's wonderful how clever I am, and how... She is charming," she went on, speaking of herself in the third person, and fancying that it was some very clever, the very cleverest and finest of men, who was saying it of her. "There is everything in her," this man continued. "Extraordinarily clever, charming, and then pretty, extraordinarily pretty, graceful. She swims, rides capitally, and a voice, a marvelous voice, one may say." She hummed her favorite musical phrase from an opera of Cherubini, flung herself into bed, laughed with delight at the thought that she would soon be asleep, called to Dunyasha to blow out the candle, and before Dunyasha had left her room, she had already passed into another still happier world of dreams, where everything was as easy and as beautiful as in reality, and was only better because it was all different. Next day the Countess sent for Boris and talked to him, and from that day he gave up visiting at the Rostovs. Chapter 14. On the 31st of December, on the eve of the new year 1810, a ball was given by a grand personage who had been a star of the court of Catherine. The Tsar and the diplomatic corps were to be present at this ball. The well-known mansion of this grandee in the English Embankment was illuminated by innumerable lights. The police were standing at the lighted entry, laid with red baize, and not merely policemen, but a police commander was at the entrance, and dozens of officers of the police. Carriages kept driving away, and fresh ones kept driving up, with grooms in red livery and grooms in plumed hats. From the carriages emerged men wearing uniforms, stars and ribbons, while ladies in satin and ermine stepped carefully out on the carriage steps that were let down with a bang, and then walked hurriedly and noiselessly over the bays of the entry. Almost every time a new carriage drove up, a whisper ran through the crowd and hats were taken off. The Emperor? No, a minister. Prince, Ambassador, don't you see the plumes?" was audible in the crowd. One person, better dressed than the rest, seemed to know everyone, and mentioned by name all the most celebrated personages of the day. A third of the guests had already arrived at this ball, while the Rostovs, who were to be present at it, were still engaged in hurried preparations. Many had been the discussions and the preparations for that ball in the Rostov family. Many the fears that an invitation might not arrive, that the dresses would not be ready, and that everything would not be arranged as it ought to be. The Rostovs were to be accompanied by Marya Ignatyevna Peronsky, a friend and relation of the Countess, a thin and yellow maid of honor of the old court, who was acting as a guide to the provincial Rostovs in the higher circles of Petersburg society. At 10 o'clock, the Rostovs were to drive to Tavrichesky Garden to call for the maid of honor. Meantime, it was 5 minutes to 10, and the young ladies were not yet dressed. Natasha was going to her first great ball. She had got up at 8 o'clock that morning, and had spent the whole day in feverish agitation and activity. All her energies had since morning been directed to the one aim of getting herself, her mother, and Sonia as well dressed as possible. Sonia and her mother put themselves entirely in her hands. The Countess was to wear a dark red velvet dress. The two girls, white tulle dresses over pink silk slips, and roses on their bodices. They were to wear their hair à la grecque. All the essentials were ready. Feet, arms, necks, and ears had been washed, scented, and powdered with peculiar care, in readiness for the ball. Open-work silk stockings and white satin shoes with ribbons had been put on. The hair-dressing was almost accomplished. Sonia was finishing dressing, so was the Countess, but Natasha, who had been busily looking after everyone, was behindhand. She was still sitting before the looking-glass with a peignoir thrown over her thin shoulders. Sonia, already dressed, stood in the middle of the room, and was trying to fasten in a last ribbon, hurting her little finger as she pressed the pin with a scrooping sound into the silk. "Not like that, Sonia, not like that," said Natasha, turning her head, and clutching her hair in both hands, as the maid arranging it was not quick enough in letting go of it. "The ribbon mustn't go like that. Come here." Sonia squatted down. Natasha pinned the ribbon in her own way. "Really, miss, you mustn't do so," said the maid, holding Natasha's hair. "Oh, my goodness, afterwards." "There, that's right, Sonia." "Will you soon be ready?" They heard the Countess's voice. "It will be 10 in a minute." "Immediately, immediately. And are you ready, Mamma?" "Only my cap to fasten on." "Don't do it without me," shouted Natasha. "You don't know how to." "But it's 10 o'clock already." It had been arranged to be at the ball at 10:30, and Natasha still had to dress, and they had to drive to Tavrichesky Garden. When her coiffure was finished, Natasha, in her mother's dressing jacket and a short petticoat, under which her dancing shoes could be seen, ran up to Sonia, looked her over, and then ran to her mother. Turning her head round, she pinned on her cap, and hurriedly kissing her gray hair, ran back to the maids, who were shortening her skirt. All attention was now centered on Natasha's skirt, which was too long. Two maids were running it up round the edge, hurriedly biting off the threads. A third one, with pins in her teeth and lips, was running from the Countess to Sonia. A fourth was holding up the whole tulle dress in her arms. "Mavrushka, quicker, darling." "Give me that thimble, miss." "Will you be quick?" said the Count from outside the door, coming in. "Here are your smelling salts. Madame Peronsky must be tired of waiting." "Ready, miss," said the maid, lifting up the shortened tulle skirt on 2 fingers, blowing something off it, and giving it a shake to show her appreciation of the transparency and purity of what she had in her hands. Natasha began putting on the dress. In a minute, don't come in, Papa," she shouted to her father at the door, from under the tulle of the dress that concealed all her face. Sonia slammed the door. A minute later the Count was admitted. He was wearing a blue frock coat, stockings, and dancing shoes, and was perfumed and pomaded. "Ah, Papa, how nice you look, lovely!" said Natasha, standing in the middle of the room, stroking out the folds of her tulle. "If you please, miss, if you please," said a maid, pulling up the skirt and turning the pins from one corner of her mouth to the other with her tongue. "Say what you like," cried Sonia, with despair in her voice, as she gazed at Natasha's skirt. "Say what you like, it's too long still." Natasha walked a little further off to look at herself in the pier-glass. The skirt was too long. "My goodness, madam, it's not a bit too long," said Mavrushka, creeping along the floor on her knees after her young lady. "Well, if it's too long, we'll tack it up in 1 minute. We'll tack it up," said Dunyasha, a resolute character. And taking a needle out of the kerchief on her bosom, she set to work again on the floor. At that moment the Countess, in her cap and velvet gown, walked shyly with soft steps into the room. "Oh, my beauty!" cried the Count. "She looks nicer than any of you." He would have embraced her, but, flushing, she drew back to avoid being crumpled. "Mamma, the cap should be more on one side," said Natasha. "I'll pin it fresh," and she darted forward. The maids, turning up her skirt, not prepared for her hasty movement, tore off a piece of the tulle. "Oh, mercy! What was that? Really, it's not my fault." "It's all right. I'll run it up. It won't show," said Dunyasha. "My beauty, my queen," said the old nurse, coming in at the doorway. "And Sonyushka, too. Ah, the beauties!" At 10:15, they were at last seated in their carriage and driving off, but they still had to drive to Tavrichesky Garden. Madame Peronsky was ready and waiting. In spite of her age and ugliness, just the same process had been going on with her as with the Rostovs, not with flurry, for with her it was a matter of routine. Her elderly and unprepossessing person had also been washed and scented and powdered. She had washed as carefully behind her ears, and like the Rostovs' nurse, her old maid had enthusiastically admired her mistress's attire. When she came into the drawing-room in her yellow gown adorned with her badge of a maid of honor, Madame Peronsky praised the Rostovs' costumes, and they praised her attire and her taste. Then, careful of their coiffures and their dresses, at 11 o'clock they settled themselves in the carriages and drove off. Chapter 15. Natasha had not had a free moment all that day, and had not once had time to think of what lay before her. In the damp, chill air, in the closeness and half-dark of the swaying carriage, she pictured to herself for the first time what was in store for her there, at the ball, in the brightly lighted halls. Music, flowers, dancing, the Tsar, all the brilliant young people of Petersburg. The prospect before her was so splendid that she could not even believe that it would come to pass. So incongruous it seemed with the chilliness, darkness, and closeness of the carriage. She could only grasp all that awaited her when, walking over the red cloth, she went into the vestibule, took off her cloak, and walked beside Sonia in front of her mother between the flowers up the lighted staircase. Only then she remembered how she must behave at a ball, and tried to assume the majestic manner that she considered indispensable for a girl at a ball. But luckily she felt that there was a mist before her eyes. She could see nothing clearly. Her pulse beat 100 times a minute, and the blood throbbed at her heart. She was unable to assume the manner that would have made her absurd, and moved on, thrilling with excitement, and trying with all her might simply to conceal it. And it was just in this mood that she looked her best. In front and behind them walked guests dressed in similar ball dresses and conversing in similarly subdued tones. The looking-glasses on the staircases reflected ladies in white, blue, and pink dresses, with diamonds and pearls on their bare arms and necks. Natasha looked into the looking-glasses and could not distinguish herself from the rest. All was mingled into one brilliant procession. At the entrance into the first room, The regular hum of voices, footsteps, greetings, deafened Natasha. The light and brilliance dazzled her still more. The host and hostess, who had been already standing at the door for half an hour, saying exactly the same words to every guest on arrival, "Charmé de vous voir," gave the same greeting to the Rostovs and Madame Peronsky. The two young girls in their white dresses, with roses alike in their black hair, made curtsies just alike, but unconsciously the hostess's eyes rested longer on the slender figure of Natasha. She looked at her, and smiled at her a smile that was something more than the smile of welcome she had for all. Looking at her, the hostess was reminded perhaps of her golden days of girlhood, gone never to return, of her own first ball. The host, too, followed Natasha with his eyes, and asked the Count which of the girls was his daughter. "Charming," he said, kissing his own fingertips. In the ballroom, guests stood crowding about the entry in expectation of the Tsar. The Countess took up her position in the front row of this crowd. Natasha heard and felt that several voices were asking who she was, that many pairs of eyes were fixed on her. She knew that she was making a good impression on those who noticed her, and this observation calmed her somewhat. There are some like ourselves, and some not as good, she thought. Madame Peronsky was pointing out to the Countess the most distinguished persons at the ball. "That is the Dutch ambassador, do you see, the grey-haired man," Madame Peronsky was saying, indicating an old man with a profusion of silver-grey curls, who was surrounded by ladies laughing at some story he was telling. "And here she comes, the Queen of Petersburg society, Countess Betsuhoff," she said, pointing to Ellen, who had just come in. "How lovely! She's quite equal to Maria Antonovna. Look how attentive all the men are to her, young and old alike. She's both lovely and clever. They say Prince so-and-so is wild about her. And you see these two, though they are not good-looking, they are even more run after." She pointed out a lady who was crossing the room, accompanied by a very ugly daughter. "That's the heiress of 1,000,000, said Madame Peronsky. "And look, here come her suitors. That's Countess Betsuhoff's brother, Anatole Kuragin," she said, pointing to a handsome officer of the Horse Guards, who passed by them, looking from the height of his lifted head over the ladies to something beyond them. "He is handsome, isn't he? They say he is to be married to that heiress. And your cousin, Drubetskoy, is very attentive to her, too. They say she has millions. Oh, that's the French ambassador himself," she said in answer to the Countess's inquiry as to the identity of Caulaincourt. "Just look, he's like some monarch. But yet they're nice. The French are very nice. No people more charming in society. Ah, here she is. Yes, still lovelier than anyone, our Maria Antonovna. And how simply dressed! Exquisite! And that stout fellow in spectacles is a universal Freemason," said Madame Peronsky, indicating Betsuhoff. "Set him beside his wife. He's a motley fool." Swinging his stout frame, Pierre slouched through the crowd, nodding to right and to left, as casually and good-naturedly as though he were walking through a crowd in a market. He made his way through the crowd unmistakably looking for someone. Natasha looked with joy at the familiar face of Pierre, the motley fool, as Madame Peronsky called him, and knew that it was they, and she in particular, of whom Pierre was in search in the crowd. Pierre had promised her to be at the ball and to find her partners. But before reaching them, Pierre came to a standstill beside a very handsome, dark man of medium height in a white uniform, who was standing in a window talking to a tall man wearing stars and a ribbon. Natasha at once recognized the handsome young man in the white uniform. It was Bolkonsky, who seemed to her to have grown much younger, happier, and better looking. "There's someone else we know. Bolkonsky, do you see, Mamma?" said Natasha, pointing out Prince Andrei. "Do you remember? He stayed a night at home, at Otradnoy." "Oh, do you know him?" said Madame Peronsky. "I can't bear him. Everyone is crazy over him. And his conceit, it's beyond all bounds. He takes after his worthy papa. And he's hand in glove now with Speransky, making out some sort of plans for reform. Just look how he behaves with ladies. She's speaking to him, and he has turned his back on her," she said, pointing to him. "I would soon send him about his business if he were to treat me like those ladies." Chapter 16. There was a sudden stir. The crowd began talking, rushed forward, then moved apart again, and down the space left open through it, the Tsar walked to the strains of the band, which struck up at once. Behind him walked the host and hostess. The Tsar walked in rapidly, bowing to right and to left, as though trying to hurry over the first moments of greeting. The musicians played the polonaise in vogue at the time on account of the words set to it. The words began, "Alexander, Elizaveta, our hearts ye ravish quite." The Tsar went into the drawing-room. The crowd made a dash for the door. Several persons ran hurriedly to the door and back with excited faces. The crowd made another rush back, away from the drawing-room door, at which the Tsar appeared in conversation with the hostess. A young man, looking distraught, pounced down on the ladies and begged them to move aside. Several, with faces that betrayed a total oblivion of all the rules of decorum, squeezed forward, to the destruction of their dresses. The men began approaching the ladies, and couples were formed for the polonaise. There was a general movement of retreat, and the Tsar, smiling, came out of the drawing-room door, leading out the lady of the house, and not keeping time to the music. He was followed by the host with Maria Antonovna Narishkin. Then came ambassadors, ministers, and various generals, whose names Madame Peronsky never tired of reciting. More than half the ladies had partners, and were taking part, or preparing to take part, in the polonaise. Natasha felt that she would be left with her mother and Sonia in that minority of the ladies who were crowded back against the wall, and not invited to dance the polonaise. She stood, her thin arms hanging at her sides, and her scarcely outlined bosom heaving regularly. She held her breath, and gazed before her with shining, frightened eyes, with an expression of equal readiness for the utmost bliss or the utmost misery. She took no interest in the Tsar, nor in all the great people Madame Peronsky was pointing out. Her mind was filled by one thought. Is it possible no one will come up to me? Is it possible that I shall not dance among the foremost? Is it possible I shall not be noticed by all these men, who now don't even seem to see me, but if they look at me, look with an expression as though they would say, "Ah, that's not she, so it's no use looking." No, it cannot be, she thought. They must know how I long to dance, how well I dance, and how they would enjoy dancing with me. The strains of the polonaise, which had already lasted some time, were beginning to sound like a melancholy reminiscence in the ears of Natasha. She wanted to cry. Madame Peronsky had left them. The Count was at the other end of the ballroom. The Countess, Sonia, and she stood in that crowd of strangers as lonely as in a forest, of no interest, of no use to anyone. Prince Andrei with a lady passed close by them, obviously not recognizing them. The handsome Anatole said something smiling to the lady on his arm, and he glanced at Natasha's face as one looks at a wall. Boris passed by them twice, and each time turned away. Berg and his wife, who were not dancing, came towards them. This family meeting here, in a ballroom, seemed a humiliating thing to Natasha, as though there were nowhere else for a family talk but here at a ball. She did not listen, and did not look at Vera, who said something to her about her own green dress. At last the Tsar stood still beside the last of his partners. He had danced with 3. The music ceased. An anxious-looking adjutant ran up to the Rostovs, begging them to move a little further back, though they were already close to the wall, and from the orchestra came the circumspect, precise, seductively stately rhythm of the waltz. The Tsar glanced with a smile down the ballroom. A moment passed. No one had yet begun. An adjutant, who was a steward, went up to Countess Betsuhoff and asked her to dance. Smiling, she raised her hand and laid it on the adjutant's shoulder without looking at him. The adjutant steward, a master of his art, grasped his partner firmly, and with confident deliberation and smoothness broke with her into the first gallop round the edge of the circle, then at the corner of the ballroom caught his partner's left hand, turned her, and through the quickening strains of the music nothing could be heard but the regular jingle of the spurs on the adjutant's rapid, practised feet, and at every third beat the swish of his partner's flying velvet skirt as she whirled round. Natasha looked at them, and was ready to cry that it was not she dancing that first round of the waltz. Prince Andrei, in his white uniform of a cavalry colonel, wearing stockings and dancing shoes, stood looking eager and lively in the front of the ring not far from the Rostovs. Baron Furhoff was talking to him of the proposed first sitting of the State Council to be held next day. From his intimacy with Speransky, and the part he was taking in the labors of the Legislative Commission, Prince Andrei was in a position to give authoritative information in regard to that sitting, about which the most diverse rumors were current. But he did not hear what Furhoff was saying to him, and looked from the Tsar to the gentleman preparing to dance, who had not yet stepped out into the ring. Prince Andrei was watching these gentlemen, who were timid in the presence of the Tsar, and the ladies, who were dying to be asked to dance. Pierre went up to Prince Andrei and took him by the arm. "You always dance. Here is my protégée, the younger Rostov girl. Ask her," he said. "Where?" asked Volkonsky. "I beg your pardon," he said, turning to the Baron. "We will finish this conversation in another place, but at a ball one must dance." He went forward in the direction indicated by Pierre. Natasha's despairing, tremulous face broke upon Prince Andrei. He recognized her, guessed her feelings, saw that it was her debut, remembered what she had said at the window, and with an expression of pleasure on his face, he approached Countess Rostov. "Permit me to introduce you to my daughter," said the Countess, reddening. "I have the pleasure of her acquaintance already, if the Countess remembers me," said Prince Andrei, with a low and courteous bow, which seemed a direct contradiction to Madame Peronsky's remarks about his rudeness. He went up to Natasha, and raised his hand to put it round her waist, before he had fully uttered the invitation to dance. He proposed a waltz to her. The tremulous expression of Natasha's face, ready for despair or for ecstasy, brightened at once into a happy, grateful, childlike smile. "I have been a long while waiting for you," that alarmed and happy young girl seemed to say to him, in the smile that peeped out through the starting tears, as she raised her hand to Prince Andrei's shoulder. They were the second couple that walked forward into the ring. Prince Andrei was one of the best dancers of his day. Natasha danced exquisitely. Her little feet, in their satin dancing shoes, performed their task lightly and independently of her, and her face beamed with a rapture of happiness. Her bare neck and arms were thin, and not beautiful, compared with Ellen's shoulders. Her shoulders were thin, her bosom undefined, her arms were slender. But Ellen was, as it were, covered with a hard varnish of those thousands of eyes that had scanned her person, while Natasha seemed like a young girl stripped for the first time, who would have been greatly ashamed if she had not been assured by everyone that it must be so. Prince Andrei loved dancing. He was anxious to escape as quickly as he could from the political and intellectual conversations into which everyone tried to draw him, and anxious, too, to break through that burdensome barrier of constraint arising from the presence of the Tsar. So he made haste to dance, and chose Natasha for a partner because Pierre pointed her out to him, and because she was the first pretty girl who caught his eyes. But he had no sooner put his arm round that slender, supple waist, and felt her stirring so close to him, and smiling so close to him, that the intoxication of her beauty flew to his head. He felt full of life and youth again, as, drawing a deep breath, he brought her to a standstill, and began to watch the other couples. Chapter 17. After Prince Andrei, Boris came up to ask Natasha to dance, and he was followed by the dancing adjutant who had opened the ball, and many other young men. Natasha, flushed and happy, passed on her superfluous partners to Sonia, and never ceased dancing all the evening. She noticed nothing and saw nothing of what was absorbing everyone else at that ball. She did not notice that the Tsar talked a long time with the French ambassador, that his manner was particularly gracious to a certain lady, that Prince So-and-so and Mr. So-and-so had said and done this and that Ellen's success had been brilliant, and that So-and-so had paid her marked attention. She did not even see the Tsar, and was only aware that he was gone from noticing that the ball became livelier after his departure. In one of the most enjoyable cotillions before supper, Prince Andrei danced again with Natasha. He reminded her of how he had first seen her in the avenue of Otradnoe, and how she could not sleep on that moonlit night, and told her how he had unwittingly listened to her. Natasha blushed at these recollections, and tried, as it were, to excuse herself, as though there were something to be ashamed of in the emotion to which Prince Andrei had unwittingly played the eavesdropper. Like all men who have grown up in society, Prince Andrei liked meeting anything not of the conventional society stamp. And such was Natasha, with her wonder, her delight, her shyness, and even her mistakes in talking French. His manner was particularly tender and circumspect as he talked to her. Sitting beside her, and talking of the simplest and most trifling subjects, Prince Andrei admired the radiant brilliance of her eyes and her smile, that had no concern with what was said, but was due simply to her own happiness. When Natasha was chosen again, and she got up with a smile and was dancing, Prince Andrei particularly admired her shy grace. In the middle of the cotillion, Natasha went back to her place, breathless at the end of a figure. Another partner again chose her. She was tired and panting, and evidently she thought for an instant of refusing, but immediately she put her hand on her partner's shoulder, and was off again gaily, smiling to Prince Andrei. "I should have been glad to rest and sit by you. I'm tired, but you see how they keep asking me, and I'm glad of it, and I'm happy, and I love everyone, and you and I understand all about it." And more, much more, was said in that smile. When her partner left her side, Natasha flew across the room to choose 2 ladies for the figure. "If she goes first to her cousin, and then to another lady, she will be my wife," Prince Andrei, greatly to his own surprise, caught himself saying mentally as he watched her. She did go first to her cousin. What nonsense does sometimes come into one's mind, thought Prince Andrei. But one thing's certain, that girl is so charming, so original, that she won't be dancing here a month before she will be married. She's a rare thing here, he thought, as Natasha settled herself beside him, sticking in the rose that was falling out of her bodice. At the end of the cotillion, the old count, in his blue frock-coat, went up to the young people who had been dancing. He invited Prince Andrei to come and see them, and asked his daughter whether she were enjoying herself. Natasha did not at once answer. She only smiled a smile that said reproachfully, "How can you ask such a question?" "Enjoying myself, as I never have before in my life," she said. And Prince Andrei noticed how her thin arms were swiftly raised, as though to embrace her father, and dropped again at once. Natasha was happy as she had never been in her life. She was at that highest pitch of happiness when one becomes completely good and kind, and disbelieves in the very possibility of evil, unhappiness, and sorrow. At that ball, Pierre for the first time felt humiliated by the position his wife took in the highest court circle. He was sullen and absent-minded. There was a broad furrow right across his forehead as he stood in a window, staring over his spectacles and seeing no one. Natasha passed close by him on her way into supper. Pierre's gloomy, unhappy face struck her. She stopped, facing him. She longed to come to his aid, to bestow on him some of her own overflowing happiness. "How delightful it is," she said. "Isn't it?" Pierre smiled an absent-minded smile, obviously not grasping what was said to him. "Yes, I'm very glad," he said. How can people be discontented at anything? Thought Natasha. Especially anyone as nice as Betsuhoff. In Natasha's eyes, all the people at the ball were particularly kind, sweet, good people, loving one another. None were capable of wronging one another, and so all must be happy. Chapter 18. Next day, when Prince Andrei thought of the ball, it did not occupy his mind for long. Yes, it was a very successful ball. And besides, yes, the younger Rostov is very charming. There's something fresh in her, original, unlike Petersburg. That was all he thought about the previous day's ball, and after his morning tea he set to work. But from fatigue and want of sleep he was not very well disposed for work, and could get nothing done. He was continually criticizing his own work, a habit common with him, and was glad when he heard a visitor arrive. The visitor was Bitsky, a man who was a member of various committees and of all the societies in Petersburg. He was a passionate adherent of the new ideas and of Speransky, and the busiest purveyor of news in Petersburg, one of those men who choose their opinions like their clothes, according to the fashion, but for that very reason seem the most vehement partisans. Scarcely waiting to remove his hat, he ran fussily up to Prince Andrei, and at once began talking. He had just learned particulars of the sitting of the State Council of that morning, opened by the Tsar, and began enthusiastically upon the subject. The Tsar's speech had been, he said, an extraordinary one. It had been a speech such as are only delivered by constitutional monarchs. The Emperor directly asserted that the Council and the Senate are the estates of the realm. He said that government should be founded not on arbitrary authority, but on a secure basis. The Emperor said that the fiscal system must be reconstituted, and the accounts must be public, Bitsky announced, laying stress on certain words, and opening his eyes significantly. Yes, today's sitting marks an epoch, the greatest epoch in our history, he concluded. Prince Andrei heard his account of the opening of the State Council, to which he had been looking forward with such eagerness, and to which he had attached so much consequence, and was amazed that now, when it had come to pass, this event, far from affecting him, struck him as less than insignificant. With quiet irony, he listened to Bitsky's enthusiastic description. The idea in his mind was of the simplest. What is it to me and Bitsky, he thought? What is it to us? Whatever the Emperor is pleased to say in the council. Can all that make me any happier or better? And this simple reflection suddenly destroyed all Prince Andrei's former interest in the reforms that were being made. That day Prince Andrei was to dine with Speransky, with only a few friends, as the host had said in inviting him. That dinner, in the intimate home circle of the man who had so fascinated him, had seemed very attractive to Prince Andrei, especially as he had not hitherto seen Speransky in his home surroundings. But now he had no wish to go to it. At the hour fixed, however, Prince Andrei was entering the small house in Tavrichesky Garden. The little house, which was Speransky's property,
was distinguished by an extraordinary cleanliness, suggestive of the cleanliness of a convent. In the parquet dining-room, Prince Andrei, who was a little late, found all that circle of Speransky's intimate friends already gathered together at 5 o'clock. There were no ladies present, except Speransky's little daughter, with a long face like her father's, and her governess. The guests were Gervais, Magnitsky, and Stolypin. From the vestibule, Prince Andrei had caught the sound of loud voices and a ringing, staccato laugh, a laugh such as one hears on the stage. Someone, it sounded like Speransky, was giving vent to a staccato ha, ha, ha. Prince Andrei had never before heard Speransky laugh, and this shrill, ringing laugh from the great statesman made a strange impression on him. Prince Andrei went into the dining-room. The whole party was standing between the two windows at a little table laid with hors d'oeuvres. Speransky was standing at the table with a mirthful countenance, wearing a grey frock coat with a star, and the white waistcoat and high white stock in which he had been at the famous sitting of the State Council. His guests formed a ring around him. Turning towards him, Magnitsky was relating an anecdote. Speransky listened, laughing beforehand at what Magnitsky was going to say. Just as Prince Andrei walked into the room, Magnitsky's words were again drowned in laughter. Stolypin gave vent to a bass guffaw as he munched a piece of bread and cheese. Gervais softly hissed a chuckle, and Speransky laughed his shrill, staccato laugh. Speransky, still laughing, gave Prince Andrei his soft, white hand. "Very glad to see you, Prince," he said. "1 minute." He turned to Magnitsky, whose tale he was interrupting. "We have made a compact today. This is a holiday dinner, and not one word about business." And he turned again to the storyteller, and again he laughed. With a sense of wondering and melancholy disillusion, Prince Andrei heard his laughter and looked at Speransky laughing. It was not Speransky, but some other man, it seemed to Prince Andrei. All that had seemed mysterious and attractive in Speransky suddenly seemed to Prince Andrei obvious and unattractive. At dinner, the conversation never paused for a moment, and consisted of something like the contents of a jest-book. Magnitsky had hardly finished his anecdote when another gentleman expressed his readiness to relate something even more amusing. The anecdotes for the most part related, if not to the service itself, to persons prominent in the service. It was as though in this circle the utter insignificance of these prominent persons was so completely accepted that the only attitude possible towards them was one of good-humored hilarity. Speransky told them how at the council that morning a deaf statesman, on being asked his opinion, replied that he was of the same opinion. Gervais described a whole episode of the revision, only remarkable for the imbecility of all concerned in it. Stolypin, stammering, took up the conversation and began talking of the abuses of the old order of things, with a warmth that threatened to give the conversation a serious turn. Magnitsky began to make fun of Stolypin's earnestness. Gervais put in his joke, and the conversation resumed its former lively tone. It was obvious that after his labors, Speransky liked to rest and be amused in the circle of his friends, and all his friends understood his tastes, and were trying to amuse him and themselves. But this kind of gaiety seemed to Prince Andrei tiresome and anything but gay. Speransky's high voice struck him unpleasantly, and his continual laugh, in its high-pitched falsetto note, was for some reason an offense to Prince Andrei's feelings. Prince Andrei did not laugh, and was afraid he would be felt uncongenial by this party. But no one noticed his lack of sympathy with the general merriment. All of them appeared to be greatly enjoying themselves. Several times he tried to enter into the conversation, but every time the word was snatched out of his mouth like a cork out of water, and he could not bandy jokes with them. There was nothing wrong or unseemly in what they said. It was all witty, and might have been amusing, but something, that very something that makes the zest of gaiety, was wanting, and they did not even know of its existence. There was nothing wrong or unseemly in what they said. It was all witty, and might have been amusing, but something, that very something that makes the zest of gaiety, was wanting, and they did not even know of its existence. After dinner, Speransky's daughter and her governess rose from the table. Speransky patted his daughter with his white hand, and kissed her. And that gesture, too, seemed to Prince Andrei unnatural. The men sat on over their port, after the English fashion. A conversation sprang up about Napoleon's doings in Spain, of which all were united in approving, while Prince Andrei attacked them. But in the middle of this discussion, Speransky, obviously wishing to change the subject, began with a smile telling an anecdote which had no connection with it. For several instants everyone was silent. As they sat at table, Speransky, corking up a bottle of wine and saying, "Nowadays good wine doesn't go a-begging," gave it to the servant and got up. All rose, and, talking just as noisily, went into the drawing-room. Speransky was handed 2 envelopes brought by a special courier. He took them and went into his study. As soon as he had gone, there was a lull in the general gaiety, and the guests began conversing sensibly in low tones together. "Well, now for the recitation," said Speransky, coming out of his study. "A marvelous talent," he said to Prince Andrei. Magnitsky at once threw himself into an attitude, and began to recite comic French verses, a skit he had composed on various well-known persons. Several times he was interrupted by applause. At the conclusion of the recitation, Prince Andrei went up to Speransky to say good-bye. "Why so early?" said Speransky. "I promised to be at a soirée." They said no more. Prince Andrei looked at those mirror-like, impenetrable eyes so close to his, and he felt it ludicrous that he should have expected anything from Speransky, and from all his own work connected with him, and marveled how he could have ascribed any value to what Speransky was doing. That punctual, mirthless laugh was ringing in Prince Andrei's ears long after he had left Speransky's. On reaching home, Prince Andrei began looking at his life in Petersburg during the last 4 months as though it were something new. He thought of the efforts he had made, and the people he had tried to see, and the history of his project of army reform, which had been accepted for consideration, and had been shelved because another scheme, a very poor one, had already been worked out and presented to the Tsar. He thought of the sittings of the committee, of which Berg was a member. He thought of the conscientious and prolonged deliberations that took place at those sittings on every point relating to the formalities of the sittings themselves, and the studious brevity with which anything relating to the reality of their duties was touched on in passing. He thought of his work on the legislative reforms, of his careful translation of the Roman and French codes into Russian, and he felt ashamed of himself. Then he vividly imagined Bogucharovo, his pursuits in the country, his expedition to Ryazan. He thought of his peasants, of Dron, the village elder, and applying the section on personal rights, which he had divided into paragraphs, to them, he marveled how he could have so long busied himself on work so idle. Chapter 19. The next day, Prince Andrei paid calls on various people whom he had not visited before, and among them on the Rostovs, with whom he had renewed his acquaintance at the ball. Apart from considerations of politeness, which necessitated a call on the Rostovs, Prince Andrei wanted to see at home that original, eager girl, who had left such a pleasant recollection with him. Natasha was one of the first to meet him. She was in a blue everyday dress, in which she struck Prince Andrei as looking prettier than in her ball dress. She and all the family received Prince Andrei like an old friend, simply and cordially. All the family, which Prince Andrei had once criticized so severely, now seemed to him to consist of excellent, simple, kindly people. The hospitality and good nature of the old Count, particularly striking and attractive in Petersburg, was such that Prince Andrei could not refuse to stay to dinner. Yes, these are good-natured, capital people, thought Bolkonsky. Of course they have no conception what a treasure they possess in Natasha, but they are good people, who make the best possible background for the strikingly poetical figure of that charming girl, so full of life. Prince Andrei was conscious in Natasha of a special world, utterly remote from him, brimful of joys unknown to him. That strange world, which even in the avenue at Otradnoy, and on that moonlight night at the window, had tantalized him. Now that no longer tantalized him, it seemed no longer an alien world, but he himself was stepping into it, and finding new pleasures in it. After dinner, Natasha went to the clavichord, at Prince Andrei's request, and began singing. Prince Andrei stood at the window talking to the ladies, and listened to her. In the middle of a phrase, Prince Andrei ceased speaking, and felt suddenly a lump in his throat from tears, the possibility of which he had not dreamed of in himself. He looked at Natasha singing, and something new and blissful stirred in his soul. He was happy, and at the same time he was sad. He certainly had nothing to weep about, but he was ready to weep. For what? For his past love? For the little princess? For his lost illusions? For his hopes for the future? Yes, and no. The chief thing which made him ready to weep was a sudden, vivid sense of the fearful contrast between something infinitely great and illimitable existing in him, and something limited and material, which he himself was, and even she was. This contrast made his heart ache, and rejoiced him while she was singing. As soon as Natasha had finished singing, she went up to him, and asked how he liked her voice. She asked this, and was abashed after saying it, conscious that she ought not to have asked such a question. He smiled, looking at her, and said he liked her singing, as he liked everything she did. It was late in the evening when Prince Andrei left the Rostovs. He went to bed from the habit of going to bed, but soon saw that he could not sleep. He lighted a candle and sat up in bed, then got up, then lay down again, not in the least wearied by his sleeplessness. He felt a new joy in his soul, as though he had come out of a stuffy room into the open daylight. It never even occurred to him that he was in love with this little Rostov girl. He was not thinking about her. He only pictured her to himself, and the whole of life rose before him in a new light as he did so. Why do I struggle? Why am I troubled in this narrow, cramped routine, when life, all life, with all its joys, lies open before me, he said to himself. And for the first time, for a very long while, he began making happy plans for the future. He made up his mind that he ought to look after his son's education, to find a tutor, and entrust the child to him. Then he ought to retire from the army, and go abroad, see England, Switzerland, Italy. I must take advantage of my liberty, while I feel so much youth and strength in me, he told himself. Pierre was right in saying that one must believe in the possibility of happiness in order to be happy, and now I do believe in it. Let us leave the dead to bury the dead, but while one is living, one must live and be happy, he thought. Chapter 20. One morning, Colonel Adolf Berg, whom Pierre knew just as he knew everyone in Moscow and Petersburg, called upon him. He was wearing a brand-new uniform, and had his powdered locks standing up over his forehead, as worn by the Tsar Alexander Pavlovitch. "I have just been calling on the Countess, your spouse, and, to my misfortune, my request could not be granted. I hope I shall be more fortunate with you, Count," he said, smiling. "What is it you desire, Colonel? I am at your disposal." "I am by now quite settled in my new quarters," Berg informed him, with perfect conviction that to hear this fact could not but be agreeable. "So I was desirous of giving a little soiree for my friends and my spouse." He smiled still more blandly. "I meant to ask the Countess and you to do me the honor to come to us for a cup of tea and to supper." Only the Countess Elena Vassilievna, who considered it beneath her to associate with nobodies like the Bergs, could have had the cruelty to refuse such an invitation.
Berg explained so clearly why he wanted to gather together a small and select company at his new rooms, and why it would be agreeable to him to do so, and why he would grudge spending money on cards or anything else harmful, but was ready for the sake of good society to incur expense, that Pierre could not refuse, and promised to come. "Only not late, Count, if I may venture to beg. 10 minutes to 8, I venture to beg. We will make up a party for Boston. Our general is coming. He is very kind to me. We will have a little supper, Count, so I shall esteem it an honor." Contrary to his usual habit, he was almost always late. Pierre arrived at the Bergs not at 10 minutes to 8, but at 7:45. The Bergs had made all necessary preparations for their little party, and were quite ready to receive their guests. Berg and his wife were sitting in a new, clean, light study, furnished with little busts and pictures and new furniture. Berg, with his new uniform closely buttoned up, sat beside his wife, and was explaining to her that one always could and ought to cultivate the acquaintance of people above one, for only then is there anything agreeable in acquaintances. You pick up something, you can put in a word for something. Look at me now, how I used to manage in the lower grades. Berg reckoned his life not by years but by promotions. My comrades are nothing still, while I'm a lieutenant colonel. I have the happiness of being your husband. He got up and kissed Vera's hand, but on the way turned back the corner of the rug, which was rucked up. And how did I obtain all this? Chiefly by knowing how to select my acquaintances. It goes without saying, of course, that one has to be conscientious and punctual in the discharge of one's duties. Berg smiled with a sense of his own superiority over a mere weak woman, and paused, reflecting that this charming wife of his was, after all, a weak woman, who could never attain all that constituted a man's dignity. Ein Mann so sein. Vera smiled, too, at the same time, with a sense of her superiority over her conscientious, excellent husband, who yet, like all men, according to Vera's ideas of them, took such a mistaken view of life. Berg, judging from his wife, considered all women weak and foolish. Vera, judging from her husband only, and generalizing from her observation of him, supposed that all men ascribed common sense to none but themselves, and at the same time had no understanding for anything, but were conceited and egoistic. Berg got up, and cautiously embracing his wife, so as not to crush the lace Bertha, for which he had paid a round sum, he kissed her just on her lips. "As only one thing, we mustn't have children too soon," he said, by a connection of ideas of which he was himself unconscious. "Yes," answered Vera, "I don't at all desire that. We must live for society." "Princess Yusupov was wearing one just like that," said Berg, pointing with a happy and good-humored smile to the Bertha. At that moment they were informed that Count Betsuhoff had arrived. Both the young couple exchanged glances of self-satisfaction, each mentally claiming the credit of this visit. "See what comes of knowing how to make acquaintances," thought Berg. "See what comes of behaving properly." "But please, when I am entertaining guests," said Vera, "don't you interrupt me, because I know with what to entertain each of them, and what to say in the company of different people." Berg, too, smiled. "Oh, but sometimes men must have their masculine conversation," he said. Pierre was shown into the little drawing-room, in which it was impossible to sit down without disturbing the symmetry, tidiness, and order, and consequently it was quite comprehensible, and not strange, that Berg should magnanimously offer to disturb the symmetry of the armchair or of the sofa for an honored guest, and apparently finding himself in miserable indecision in the matter, should leave his guest to solve the question of selection. Pierre destroyed the symmetry, moved out a chair for himself, and Berg and Vera promptly began their soirée, interrupting each other in their efforts to entertain their guest. Vera, deciding in her own mind that Pierre ought to be entertained with conversation about the French embassy, promptly embarked upon that subject. Berg, deciding that masculine conversation was what was required, interrupted his wife's remarks by reference to the question of war with Austria, and made an unconscious jump from that general subject to personal considerations upon the proposal made him to take part in the Austrian campaign, and the reasons which had led him to decline it. Although the conversation was extremely disconnected, and Vera resented the intervention of the masculine element, both the young people felt with satisfaction that although only one guest was present, the soiree had begun very well, and that their soiree was as like every other soiree as 2 drops of water, with the same conversation and tea and lighted candles. The next to arrive was Boris, an old comrade of Berg's. There was a certain shade of patronage and condescension in his manner to Berg and Vera. After Boris came the colonel and his lady, then the general himself, then the Rostovs, and the soiree now began to be exactly, incontestably like all other soirees. Berg and Vera could hardly repress their smiles of glee at the sight of all this movement in their drawing-room, at the sound of the disconnected chatter, and the rustle of skirts and of curtsies. Everything was precisely as everybody always has it. Especially so was the general, who admired their rooms, clapped Berg on the shoulder, and with paternal authority insisted on arranging the table for Boston. The general sat by Count Ilya Andreevich, as the guest next in precedence to himself. The elderly guests were together, the younger people together, the hostess at the tea-table, on which there were cakes in the silver cake basket, exactly like the cakes at the Panins' soirée. Everything was precisely like what everybody else had. Chapter 21. Pierre, as one of the most honored guests, was obliged to sit down to Boston with the old count, the general, and the colonel. As he sat at the Boston table, he happened to be directly facing Natasha, and he was struck by the curious change that had come over her since the day of the ball. Natasha was silent, and not only was she not so pretty as she had been at the ball, she would have been positively plain, but for the look of gentle indifference to everything in her face. "What is wrong with her?" Pierre wondered, glancing at her. She was sitting by her sister at the tea-table. She gave reluctant answers to Boris at her side, and did not look at him. After playing all of one suit, and taking 5 tricks to his partner's satisfaction, Pierre, having caught the sound of greetings and the steps of someone entering while he took his tricks, glanced at her again. "Why, what has happened to her?" he said to himself in still greater wonder. Prince Andrei was standing before her, saying something to her with an expression of guarded tenderness on his face. She, lifting her head, was looking at him, flushing crimson, and visibly trying to control her breathing, which came in panting gasps. And the vivid glow of some inner fire that had been quenched before was alight in her again. She was utterly transformed. From a plain girl, she was once more the beautiful creature she had been at the ball. Prince Andrei went up to Pierre, and Pierre noticed a new, youthful expression in his friend's face. Several times Pierre changed his seat during the play, sitting sometimes with his back to Natasha, sometimes facing her, and during all the 6 rubbers he was observing her and his friend. "Something very serious is happening between them," thought Pierre, and a feeling at once of gladness and of bitterness made him agitated and forgetful of the game. After 6 rubbers, the general got up, saying it was of no use playing like that, and Pierre was at liberty. Natasha, at one side of the room, was talking to Sonia and Boris. Vera, with a subtle smile, was saying something to Prince Andrei. Pierre went up to his friend, and asking whether they were talking secrets, sat down beside them. Vera, noticing Prince Andrei's attention to Natasha, felt that at a soirée, a real soirée, it was absolutely necessary there should be delicate allusions to the tender passion, and seizing an opportunity when Prince Andrei was alone, began a conversation with him upon the emotions generally, and her sister in particular. She felt that, with a guest so intellectual as she considered Prince Andrei,
She must put all her diplomatic tact into the task before her. When Pierre went up to them, he noticed that Vera was in full flow of self-complacent talk, while Prince Andrei seemed embarrassed, a thing that rarely happened to him. "What do you think?" Vera was saying with a subtle smile. "You, Prince, have so much penetration, and see into people's characters at once. What do you think about Natalie? Is she capable of constancy in her attachments? Is she capable, like other women," Vera meant herself, "of loving a man once for all, and remaining faithful to him forever? That's what I regard as true love. What do you think, Prince?" "I know your sister too little," answered Prince Andrei, with a sarcastic smile, under which he tried to conceal his embarrassment, "to decide a question so delicate. And besides, I have noticed that the less attractive a woman is, the more constant she is apt to be," he added, and he looked at Pierre, who at that moment joined them. "Yes, that is true, Prince. In these days," pursued Vera, talking of these days, as persons of limited intellect as a rule love to do, supposing they have discovered and estimated the peculiarities of the times, and that human characteristics do change with the times. "In these days, a girl has so much liberty that the pleasure of being paid attention often stifles these feelings in her, and Natalie, it must be confessed, is very susceptible on that side." This going back to Natasha again made Prince Andrei contract his brows disagreeably. He tried to get up, but Vera persisted with a still more subtle smile. "Nobody, I imagine, has been so much run after as she has," Vera went on, "but no one, until quite of late, has ever made a serious impression on her. Of course you know, Count," she turned to Pierre, "even our charming cousin, Boris, who, entre nous, was very, very far gone in the region of the tender passion." She intended an allusion to the map of love then in fashion. Prince Andrei scowled and was mute. "But of course, you are a friend of Boris's," Vera said to him. "Yes, I know him." "He has probably told you of his childish love for Natasha?" "Oh, was there a childish love between them?" asked Prince Andrei, with a sudden, unexpected flush on his face. "Yes. You know, between cousins, the close intimacy often leads to love. Cousinhood is a dangerous neighborhood, isn't it?" "Oh, not a doubt of it," said Prince Andrei, and with sudden and unnatural liveliness he began joking with Pierre about the necessity of his being careful with his cousins at Moscow, ladies of 50, and in the middle of these jesting remarks he got up, and, taking Pierre's arm, drew him aside. "Well, what is it?" said Pierre, who had been watching in wonder his friend's excitement, and noticed the glance he turned upon Natasha as he got up. I must talk to you," said Prince Andrei. "You know that pair of women's gloves?" He referred to the Masonic gloves given to a newly initiated brother to be entrusted to the woman he loved. But no, I will talk to you later on." And with a strange light in his eyes and a restlessness in his movements, Prince Andrei approached Natasha and sat down beside her. Pierre saw that Prince Andrei asked her some question, and she answered him, flushing hotly. But at that moment Berg approached Pierre, and insisted upon his taking part in an argument between the general and the colonel on affairs in Spain. Berg was satisfied and happy. The smile of glee never left his face. The soirée was a great success, and exactly like other soirées he had seen. Everything was precisely similar. The ladies' refined conversation, and the cards, and after the cards, the general raising his voice, and the samovar and the tea-cakes. But one thing was still lacking, which he had always seen at soirées, and wished to imitate. There was still wanting the usual loud conversation between the gentlemen, and discussion about some serious intellectual question. The general had started that conversation, and Berg drew Pierre into it. Chapter 22. Next day, Prince Andrei went to dine at the Rostovs, as Count Ilya Andreich had invited him, and spent the whole day with them. Everyone in the house perceived on whose account Prince Andrei came, and he openly tried to be all day long with Natasha. Not only in the soul of Natasha, scared but happy and enthusiastic, in the whole household, too, there was a feeling of awe, of something of great gravity being bound to happen. With sorrowful and sternly serious eyes, the Countess looked at Prince Andrei as he talked to Natasha, and shyly and self-consciously tried to begin some insignificant talk with him as soon as he looked round at her. Sonia was afraid to leave Natasha, and afraid of being in their way if she stayed with them. Natasha turned pale in a panic of expectation every time she was left for a moment alone with him. Prince Andrei's timidity impressed her. She felt that he wanted to tell her something, but could not bring himself up to the point. When Prince Andrei had gone away in the evening, the Countess went up to Natasha and whispered, "Well?" "Mamma, for God's sake, don't ask me anything just now. This one can't talk of," said Natasha. But in spite of this answer, Natasha lay a long while in her mother's bed that night, her eyes fixed before her, excited and scared by turns. She told her how he had praised her, how he had said he was going abroad, how he had asked where they were going to spend the summer, and how he had asked her about Boris. "But anything like this, I have never felt before," she said. "Only I'm afraid with him. I'm always afraid with him. What does that mean? Does it mean that it's the real thing? Mamma, are you asleep?" "No, my darling. I'm afraid of him myself," answered her mother. "Go to bed." "Anyhow, I shouldn't go to sleep. How stupid sleep is. Mamma, nothing like this have I ever felt before," she said, with wonder and terror at the feeling she recognized in herself. "And could we ever have dreamed—" It seemed to Natasha that she had fallen in love with Prince Andrei the first time she saw him at Otradnoy. She was, as it were, terrified at this strange, unexpected happiness that the man she had chosen even then, she was firmly convinced that she had done so, that very man should meet them again now, and be apparently not indifferent to her. "And it seems as though it all happened on purpose. His coming to Petersburg just while we are here, and our meeting at that ball. It was all fate. It's clear that it is fate, that it has all led up to this. Even then, as soon as I saw him, I felt something quite different." "What has he said to you? What are those verses? Read them," said the mother thoughtfully, referring to the verses Prince Andrei had written in Natasha's album. "Mamma, does it matter his being a widower?" "Hush, Natasha. Pray to God. Marriages are made in heaven," she said, quoting the French proverb. "Mamma, darling, how I love you! How happy I am!" cried Natasha, shedding tears of excitement and happiness, and hugging her mother. At that very time, Prince Andrei was telling Pierre of his love for Natasha, and of his fixed determination to marry her. That evening, the Countess Elena Vassilievna gave a reception. The French ambassador was there, and a royal prince who had become a very frequent visitor at the Countess's of late, and many brilliant ladies and gentlemen. Pierre came down to it, wandered through the rooms, and impressed all the guests by his look of concentrated preoccupation and gloom. Pierre had been feeling one of his attacks of nervous depression coming upon him ever since the day of the ball, and had been making desperate efforts to struggle against it. Since his wife's intrigue with the royal prince, Pierre had been, to his surprise, appointed a Kammerherr, and ever since he had felt a sense of weariness and shame in court society, and his old ideas of the vanity of all things human began to come back oftener and oftener. The feeling he had lately noticed between his protégée Natasha and Prince Andrei had aggravated his gloom by the contrast between his own position and his friend's. He tried equally to avoid thinking of his wife and also of Natasha and Prince Andrei. Again, everything seemed to him insignificant in comparison with eternity. Again the question rose before him, what for? And for days and nights together he forced himself to work at Masonic labors, hoping to keep off the evil spirit. Pierre had come out of the Countess's apartments at midnight, and was sitting in a shabby dressing gown at the table in his own low-pitched, smoke-blackened room upstairs, copying out long transactions of the Scottish Freemasons, when someone came into his room. It was Prince Andrei. "Oh, it's you," said Pierre, with a preoccupied and dissatisfied air. "I'm at work, you see," he added, pointing to the manuscript book, with that look of escaping from the ills of life with which unhappy people look at their work. Prince Andrei stood before Pierre with a radiant, ecstatic face, full of new life, and with the egoism of happiness smiled at him without noticing his gloomy face. "Well, my dear boy," he said, "I wanted to tell you yesterday, and I have come to do so today. I have never felt anything like it. I am in love." Pierre suddenly heaved a heavy sigh, and dumped down his heavy person on the sofa beside Prince Andrei. "With Natasha Rostov, yes?" he said. "Yes, yes, who else could it be? I would never have believed it, but the feeling is too strong for me. Yesterday I was in torment, in agony, but I would not exchange that agony even for anything in the world. I have never lived till now, but I cannot live without her. But can she love me? I'm too old for her. Why don't you speak?" "I? I? What did I tell you?" said Pierre, suddenly getting up and walking about the room. "I always thought so. That girl is a treasure. She's a very rare sort of a girl. My dear fellow, don't, I entreat you, be too wise. Don't doubt. Marry, marry, marry. And I'm sure no man was ever happier than you will be. But she? She loves you." "Don't talk nonsense," said Prince Andrei, smiling and looking into Pierre's face. "She loves you, I know it," Pierre cried angrily. "No, do listen," said Prince Andrei, taking hold of him by the arm and stopping him. "Do you know the state I am in? I must talk about it to someone." "Well, well, talk away. I'm very glad," said Pierre, and his face did really change. The line of care in his brow was smoothed away, and he listened gladly to Prince Andrei. His friend seemed, and was indeed, an utterly different new man. What had become of his ennui, his contempt of life, his disillusionment? Pierre was the only person to whom he could have brought himself to speak quite openly, but to him he did reveal all that was in his heart. Readily and boldly he made plans reaching far into the future, said he could not sacrifice his own happiness to the caprices of his father, declared that he would force his father to agree to the marriage and like her, or dispense with his consent altogether. Then he marveled at the feeling which had taken possession of him, as something strange and apart, independent of himself. "I should never have believed it, if anyone had told me I could love like this," said Prince Andrei. "It is utterly different from the feeling I once had. The whole world is split into two halves for me. One, she, and there all is happiness, hope, and life. The other half, all where she is not. There all is dejection and darkness." "Darkness and gloom," repeated Pierre. "Yes, yes, I understand that. I can't help loving the light. That's not my fault. And I am very happy. Do you understand me? I know you are glad for me." "Yes, yes," Pierre assented, looking at his friend with eyes full of tenderness and sadness.
The brighter the picture of Prince Andrei's fate before his mind, the darker seemed his own. Chapter 23. To get married, his father's consent was wanted, and to obtain this, Prince Andrei set off to see his father. The father received his son's communication with external composure, but with inward wrath. He could not comprehend how anyone could want to alter his life, to introduce any new element into it, when life was for him so near its end. "If they would only let me live my life out as I want to, and then do as they like," the old man said to himself. With his son, however, he made use of that diplomacy to which he always had resort in case of gravity. Assuming a calm tone, he went into the whole question judicially. In the first place, the marriage was not a brilliant one from the point of view of birth, fortune, or distinction. Secondly, Prince Andrei was not in his first youth, and was delicate in health. The old man laid special stress on this, and the girl was very young. Thirdly, there was his son, whom it would be a pity to entrust to a mere girl. "Fourthly, and finally," said the father, looking ironically at his son, "I beg you to defer the matter for a year. Go abroad and get well. Find a German, as you want to do so, for Prince Nikolai, and then, if your love, your passion, your obstinacy, whatever you choose, are so great, then get married. And that's my last word on the subject. You know, the last," the old prince concluded, in a tone that showed that nothing would compel him to alter his decision. Prince Andrei saw clearly that the old man hoped that either his feeling or that of his betrothed would not stand the test of a year, or that he, the old prince, would die himself in the course of it, and he decided to act in accordance with his father's wish, to make an offer, and to defer the marriage for a year. 3 weeks after his last visit to the Rostovs, Prince Andrei returned to Petersburg. The day after her conversation with her mother, Natasha spent the whole day expecting Bolkonsky, but he did not come. The next day and the third it was just the same. Pierre, too, stayed away, and Natasha, not knowing Prince Andrei had gone away to see his father, did not know how to interpret his absence. So passed the 3 weeks. Natasha would not go out anywhere, and wandered like a shadow about the house, idle and listless, wept at night in secret, and did not go in to her mother in the evenings. She was continually flushing and very irritable. It seemed to her that everyone knew of her disappointment, was laughing at her, and pitying her. In spite of all the intensity of her inward grief, the wound to her vanity aggravated her misery. She came into the Countess one day, tried to say something, and all at once burst into tears. Her tears were the tears of an offended child, who does not know why it is being punished. The Countess tried to comfort Natasha. At first she listened to her mother's words, but suddenly she interrupted her. "Stop, Mamma. I don't think of him, or want to think of him. Why, he kept coming, and he has left off, and he has left off." Her voice quivered. She almost began to cry, but recovered herself, and went on calmly. "And I don't want to be married at all, and I'm afraid of him. I have quite got over it now." The day after this conversation, Natasha put on the old dress she specially associated with the fun she had often had when wearing it in the mornings, and began from early morning to take up her old manner of life, which she had given up ever since the ball. After morning tea, she went into the big hall, which she particularly liked on account of the loud resonance in it, and began singing her so-fa exercises. When she had finished the first exercise, she stood still in the middle of the room and repeated the single musical phrase which particularly pleased her. She listened with delight, as though it were new to her, to the charm of these notes ringing out, filling the empty space of the great room and dying slowly away, and she felt all at once cheerful. Why think so much about it? Things are nice even as it is,
she said to herself, and she began walking up and down the room, not putting her feet simply down on the resounding parquet, but at each step bending her foot from the heel to the toe. She had on some new shoes she particularly liked, and listening to the regular tap of the heel and creak of the toe with the same pleasure with which she had listened to the sound of her own voice. Passing by the looking-glass, she glanced into it. "Yes, that's me," the expression of her face seemed to say at the sight of herself. "Well, and very nice, too. And I need nobody." A footman would have come in to clear away something in the room, but she would not let him come in. She shut the door after him and continued her promenade about the room. She had come back that morning to her favorite mood of loving herself and being ecstatic over herself. "What a charming creature that Natasha is," she said again of herself, speaking as some third person, a generic masculine person. "Pretty, a voice, young, and she's in nobody's way. Only leave her in peace." But, however much she might be left in peace, she could not now be at peace, and she felt that immediately. In the vestibule, the hall door opened. Someone was asking, "At home?" and steps were audible. Natasha was looking at herself in the glass, but she did not see herself. She heard sounds in the vestibule. When she saw herself, her face was pale. It was he. She knew it for certain, though she herself caught the sound of his voice at the opened door. Natasha, pale and panic-stricken, flew into the drawing-room. "Mamma, Bolkonsky has come," she said. "Mamma, this is awful, unbearable. I don't want to be tortured. What am I to do?" The Countess had not time to answer her before Prince Andrei, with a troubled and serious face, walked into the drawing-room. As soon as he saw Natasha, his face beamed with delight. He kissed the Countess's hand and Natasha's, and sat down beside the sofa. "It's a long while since we have had the pleasure," the Countess was beginning, but Prince Andrei cut her short, answering her implied question, and obviously in haste to say what he had to say. "I have not been to see you all this time, because I have been to see my father. I had to talk over a very important matter with him. I only returned last night," he said, glancing at Natasha. "I want to have a talk with you, Countess," he added after a moment's silence. The Countess dropped her eyes, sighing heavily. "I am at your disposal," she brought out. Natasha knew she ought to go, but she was unable to do so. Something seemed gripping her throat, and regardless of civility, she stared straight at Prince Andrei with wide-open eyes. "At once? This minute? No, it cannot be," she was thinking. He glanced at her again, and that glance convinced her that she was not mistaken. Yes, at once, this very minute, her fate was to be decided. "Run away, Natasha. I will call you," the Countess whispered. With frightened and imploring eyes, Natasha glanced at Prince Andrei and at her mother, and went out. "I have come, Countess, to ask for your daughter's hand," said Prince Andrei. The Countess's face flushed hotly, but she said nothing. "Your offer," the Countess began at last, sedately. He sat silent, looking into her face. "Your offer," she hesitated in confusion, "is agreeable to us, and I accept your offer. I am glad of it. And my husband, I hope, but it must rest with herself." "I will speak to her when I have received your consent. Do you give it me?" said Prince Andrei. "Yes," said the Countess, and she held out her hand to him, and with mingled feelings of aversion and tenderness, she pressed her lips to his forehead as he bent to kiss her hand. Her wish was to love him as a son, but she felt that he was a man alien to her, and that she was afraid of him. "I am sure my husband will consent," said the Countess. "But your father—" "My father, whom I have informed of my plans, has made it an express condition that the marriage should not take place for a year. That, too, I meant to speak of to you," said Prince Andrei.